Hey there, and welcome back to my very slow release schedule of reviews for the final season of Stranger Things. I mean, at this point we're weeks out of date, but my god, I made a commitment to doing these, and I will finish them, no matter what. Before we go any further, I will say that we're doing this as full spoilers, because the season has long since ended now, and I just can't be bothered pretending like that isn't the case. So full spoilers ahead, which is probably going to change how I view some of these episodes now. As this is volume 2 and we've had a break between the releases, we start off with a little bit of a recap of the final scene of Sorcerer, where Vecna taunts Will and reveals that the reason he used him, and the kids in general, is that he views him as weak and shapeable. He then leaves them all to be mauled by the Demogorgons, but Will's able to tap into his powers and kills them all at once, and not just the Demo attacking Mike, but the ones attacking Lucas and Robin too. Here's where the story picks up, with Will being helped to his feet by Joyce, and with Mike celebrating that Will's become a real-life sorcerer. However, despite that happiness at being alive, there's also the depressing element of them having lost all the kids. I think it would actually even be more depressing because I think it's clear that they did have a chance of actually protecting Derek. This whole plan was to try to get them all out of the Hawkins town limits, and thus out of range of Vecna and his goons. Therefore, he wouldn't have been able to go through with his plans, and they'd have more time to try to stop him. They had Derek with them, but they chose to use him in their escape plan for the other kids, and they lost. Now all the kids, including Derek, are gone. You'd absolutely feel like shit, and thus, even though Will has his powers now, I 100% get why he wouldn't be feeling too hyped up. The military then begins returning to their location, as obviously at some point during the massacre they called for help, and so the trio escape into the tunnels underneath Radio Shack that somehow the military don't know about. Full-on escape tunnels, and they don't know they exist. Okay. We talked about this in an earlier review, so I won't go too much into it, but it does stretch believability, doesn't it? From here, we follow up with the kids who are taken by Vecna. We see them all get strapped in and have the tube attached to their face and force-fed slugs, and they wake up in the apparent safety of Henry's dream world. Here we have a really creepy scene where he sits them all down and talks to them about how they're special children and that he saved them from the monsters. That they all have powers that together they can unlock, and by doing so, they can draw a better world to their own, and by doing that, they'll be able to save everything and everyone and drive off the darkness, bringing a new light. This scene is just perfectly done in my opinion. Vecna is such a well-written and well-acted character up to this point in the story, and I love that you, the viewer, knowing that he's evil and horrible, can clearly see the freaky psycho lurking underneath with massive cult leader vibes, but his words and his tone are warm, and he says all the right things to the kids, and thus he's able to completely bring them under his power. It makes a lot of sense that they'd trust him, and it doesn't feel very forced. The only two that very obviously don't buy into his spiel are Holly, who's been warned by Max, and then Derek, who had spent time with Mike and Will, and thus learned the truth about Vecna too. I love that they had Derek clearly trying to suss out whether Holly's on board with Vecna a couple times in the scene itself, and whilst it clearly does show that, I did like that they kept it subtle enough that you get that fun little surprise later where he goes and finds Holly and Max in the woods. From here we get the opening credits, and then the military back into the Upside Down trying to break into the room that Carly had been held in. I will say that it really doesn't seem like they have enough men to be doing this kind of thing, considering they just got wrecked earlier on, but I suppose they're just meant to be completely incompetent, which is frustrating looking back on things because I think this plotline had a lot of potential, which ended up being largely squandered for no real reason. Even as villains, from this point onwards, they feel like they largely don't matter all that much and are just there. It's such a shame. They enter the room and only find Carly there with nobody else, and so they go in search of them throughout the facility until Kay takes a closer look at Carly and realizes she's simply an illusion, and that was how they managed to escape. She'd used her powers, and this allowed her, Hopper, and Al to drive away somewhere safe. We then get a fairly awkward car scene after Carly disconnects her powers, seeing as she's too far away to keep them going. Hopper tries to sort of make small talk, but Carly's massively in shock, I guess, and Al is clearly pissed off because he was going to try to commit suicide and take Vecna out at the same time. To be honest, it was around this time I started finding that particular storyline a little bit tedious. It comes back around, but this trio was just not it for me. We return to Hawkins to find our other trio wandering through the tunnels, where they stumble across Lucas and tend to his injury he got protecting the kids from being taken. Whilst it does look pretty gnarly, at the same time, it's not so bad, I guess. After all, let's not forget that one swipe from a demo put Ted into a coma and disfigured Karen quite badly too. Plus there are all the soldiers that got obliterated in one hit. So in the end, you could argue that Lucas got out of that pretty lightly, and yeah, it's a bit plot armory, I guess, but at the same time, you can write it off as Vecna not caring to kill them at that stage and instead hyper-focusing on getting the vessels. I think what I like the most about this sequence and then the one after where they're walking through the tunnels is just the friendship moments we get to see. Will comforting Lucas about losing the kids and telling him that he had a nice swing when he was fighting the demo. Then Lucas getting super hyped about Will having powers and being a real-life Will the Wise. Plus then also Mike trying to correct him that he's not really a wizard, but is actually a sorcerer because his powers are innate. These little moments actually make them seem like friends. Instead of being told how they're super close, you get to see it play out with the banter and the hype, and it makes me think of the earlier seasons a lot more. I just love those sorts of moments. I also really love that now she's accepted that Will is powerful, Joyce is just fully on board with any crazy scheme they can cook up. Thus she starts talking to him about trying to jack back into the hive mind and gives him confidence once again. Despite using those powers, it's clear that Will thinks that he failed as the kids were taken, and he views himself the way that Vecna does, as weak. Joyce is able to show him though that everybody has been wrong to underestimate Will, and Vecna will continue to do so, which will allow them to catch him by surprise and potentially win. It's just a really wholesome, beautiful moment, and I love how the dynamic shifted over the course of the season. Back to the the Hopper/Al storyline, we have them arrive to pick up the secondary group of Steve, Nancy, Jonathan, and Dustin. At the same time as all of this, Al is laying into Hopper, who is clearly trying to move on from the fact that he was going to kill himself, with Al believing that this was always his intention, to kill himself and stop Vecna by doing so, ensuring Al survives. That being said, let's say Vecna was in the room at the end of Volume 1 and Hopper blew himself up and managed to kill him. Wasn't Al under the effects of kryptonite the whole time? She could barely move, and thus I'm pretty sure they would have caught her even though he tried to get her to run away, and she would have been locked up to be experimented on forever. I'm not really sure that he thought his terrible plan through in that moment. He doesn't want to see another daughter die, yes, but surely death is preferable to whatever awaited her otherwise, right? I suppose that's part of his character though. He's somewhat blinded by his trauma and past experiences, and it heavily clouds his judgment and makes him make rash decisions. As they're discussing this, Carly comes out and reveals that the group are nowhere to be found, with a reveal that they've made their way to Hawkins Lab to investigate Dustin's theories. To be honest, on my first watch of this scene when it first came out, I found it to be very, very tedious. Yeah, I guess they give us a bit of exposition about what they think the fleshy wall is and how they can destroy it and therefore get to Holly, but at the same time, so much of it is constant sniping back and forth, which has been going on for so long at this point. Plus, we then also have the other drama with Hopper and Al, and I was at my limit. We have Steve argue that when the team split up, he doesn't want to work with either Dustin or Jonathan, and only Nancy, which lures him into an argument with Jonathan, where he claims that Steve is pushing his luck, always creeping on Nancy. Then Steve goes on to deny this, even though it is blatantly obvious to quite literally everybody in the story, and to every single viewer. So yes, very tedious the entire way, through the lobby to the staircases, and then again on a second watch, even though I felt like this was the case, at least there's that silver lining that the drama with Steve and Dustin, as well as Nancy and Jonathan, will be resolved pretty soon. I also have to say, and this is a trend that I've noticed beyond just this scene, but Steve is so annoying right now. I feel the episodes have majorly honed in on how Dustin's being an asshole in general, and yes, that is the case, but Steve is too. I feel like he's not on board with literally anything they're up to, and is also looking for a fight or an opportunity to snark any chance he gets. All of this just makes me want the scenes to move on from this storyline at any cost, even though there's some potentially interesting stuff going on in the background, and it's a shame. They just went too hard on this for me. From here we cut over to Camazotz, where the kids are all playing and having fun inside, whilst Holly's clearly out of it and very scared. When she feels like all the other kids are distracted, she grabs her cloak and fire poker and heads off to find Max, who is at first angry because this isn't the plan, until Holly reveals that Henry's going to summon a new world to theirs, and they no longer have any more time to waste. Derek makes an appearance and reveals what he knows, and that he's part of a wider group outside trying to help. Once again, simply through his presence in the scene, I am completely engrossed. This kid just has it, and was the perfect choice for the role. He's added so much flavour to his scenes, and it's honestly crazy to see how far his character's come over the course of the season. When he was first introduced as a generic schoolyard bully type character, I really thought he'd be a massively minor player, but here, he's having a full story arc of becoming a hero of his own, and it's great. Also, I don't know why, but when he was listing out all his friends and then he said Mrs. Byers, that made me laugh. Then him calling Robin Miss Robin, oh, that was so cute. Holly comes up with a plan to allow her and Max to escape, although it's going to require Derek to stay behind and return to his previous dipshit persona. And this brave lad is fully on board, which I loved. Stranger Things really does excel at making these side characters that capture your heart in a handful of episodes, don't they? Previous season logic would dictate that they'd be killed off to make you sad and up the stakes, whilst also preserving the lives of the main cast. That being said, I'm glad that Derek and the other minor new characters made it through the whole thing in one piece, as I think it would have just felt wrong in that case, you know? We cut over to the Squawk to follow up with the Hawkins storyline for yet another sit-down plan explanation scene, which by this point I'm getting a bit tired of. It really does feel like they go back to the well with these types of scenes again and again and again, and this isn't even close to the last time they have one of these. Hell, here they have Joyce give her plan, they have a brief food break, and then they come back and both Lucas and Erica have their own monologues where they each explain their own plan. At least the second one is carried by the back and forth banter of both the siblings. The first part didn't even have that. Erica's plan is to go out and speak to Mr. Clark, who taught Dustin everything he knows, and get him to build a new telemetry tracker. Meanwhile, Lucas says that since they have a dead Demogorgon on hand, they should just go ahead and bring it back to life by heating it up, thereby reactivating the particles within it. This would in turn allow Will to jack back into the hive mind and try to do a precision strike on Vecna, and possibly kill him. A bit of a Hail Mary type plan, but they're running out of time, and they don't really have any other options, so I get why they do it. However, before all that, we have some more angst with the Hawkins Lab team. This whole sequence is honestly just torture for me. Maybe some people liked it, but I'm just over it and it's tedious to sit through. Steve and Dustin once again have another argument, with both of them seeming like dickheads, and then we cut over to Nancy and Jonathan, who have their own issues that they're not getting along, and their relationship's extremely strained, and to be honest, this is the kind of thing I was looking for in Volume 1, you know? I would have wanted Volume 2 to more heavily focus on the battle against Vecna and the army, because in the end, I came away from the season feeling that neither of those was done the justice they deserved. That being said, at least at the end of this sequence, it does lead into Nancy and Jonathan making a discovery of the melted walls and the stairs as they begin to work their way towards the roof, so there is that. I also just gotta say, I felt like the issues between Nancy and Jonathan were not really ever adequately explained up to this point. We can obviously see that they have problems and whatnot, but it never goes deeper, and this is the 5th episode. We don't get any of that until the breakup scene, a very vague breakup scene that they had to explain out of story, but we'll get to that later, I suppose. Here we cut back to Hopper's group with with Hopper continually trying to get in contact with the lab team to no avail, whilst inside, we have a pretty key conversation between Carly and Al that ends up shaping the whole ending of the show. Al apologizes for not searching for Carly and then asks how much she knew about Henry. She reveals that she knew everything, and so I do wonder if this means she also escaped from Hawkins Lab in the same way that Al was going to with Henry's help. However, instead of helping him remove his chip, she just took off and left him there. Then again, how could she have even learned everything just like that? Did Henry tell her about his past? Or was it when she was hunting people responsible for the labs and they revealed everything over time? I kind of thought that would have tied deeper into the story than it ended up being. Elle then asked for her help to fight Henry, as then afterwards they'd all be able to live free, which is where Carly starts to talk about her own experiences with Dr. K and why she thinks it can never end. She tells Elle about how her friends that we met in season 2 were murdered, and that Dr. K took her for her blood, taking endless samples for her own ends. After a time, Carly was able to break free by pretending to be dead, and then takes her scalpel and murders 2 doctors and swipes their keycard. Frustratingly though, she claims that she never would have left if she knew what was on the other side of the door, and then the scene cuts away for 15 minutes. It was just getting good. I know a lot of people don't like Carly or the acting for her, but I think it fits the world and her experience here. I simply think that a lot of people have lingering bitterness from that episode of season 2, and this in turn colours their perspectives on the character and the actress. From here we move over to Camazotz for a brief check-in with Derek, who's returned to his dipshit nature for the mission, and who makes a scene heading into the woods in front of some of the kids, calling Vecna Mr. Rogers disparagingly, and saying that he can suck his fat one. Of course, the idea here is that Vecna's going to search for Derek, and Derek is supposed to make it to the cave, and by doing so, he's going to be safe. Thus, this will give Max and Holly the chance to try to escape Camazotz by moving through Holly's various different memories of Vecna until they come out into the real world. That being said, their plan, it doesn't seem that good to me. After all, Vecna's then going to hunt for Derek, and if Derek heads into the cave, he's going to go back to the house unable to do anything, and this would all happen relatively quickly. On top of that, once a single kid goes missing, you'd know that he's in league with Max, and they'd do a quick head check, right? Realize that Derek knew about the cave, notice Holly isn't there, and put 2 and 2 together. Then he'd hunt them down and try to kill them. It feels like it might have been a better play to try to do this a different way, and hope he didn't notice that they weren't there whilst all the other kids are playing. I don't know, this seems like a pretty terrible plan from the get-go, you know? I know they're stressed, but still. We cut over to Robin and Will, and we check in with more of Will's personal story, where he asks more about her life, and we get the setup for him eventually telling people the truth about himself to other people, although I will say, he takes it to an extreme, doesn't it? I mean, her advice here is to tell one person, which is what she did, and that she'd been slowly working her way up since then. I figured this in turn would culminate in him telling the rest of the party, or maybe his mum and Jonathan, and it being a big emotional moment. Instead, he goes full nuclear, and, you know, good for him, it's just not what I was expecting, you know? Once again, this is something we're going to talk more in depth about when we get to it in the future. It's just strange that he takes most of Robin's advice across the season, until we get to this step, and then suddenly he goes either 100 or nothing. I guess that's one way of doing things. We return to Camazotz, where Max and Holly are dawdling their way through the place that Holly woke up in when she first came into the world, and good God, maybe it's time to have some haste, yeah? This is probably a bit of a consistent issue with the storyline. A lack of haste. Derek is slowly walking towards the cave. These two are slowly looking for an escape. Speed up! You know there's an eldritch demon man who's gonna want to kill you if he catches you? Do they remember that part? Anyway, they make their way inside the very obvious floating door, just after Max said it would be hard to find, which did make me laugh, and here we go through some of the memories of Holly's experiences with Vecna. That he was first watching Holly on Halloween, so the 31st of October, which is really confusing to me. She apparently doesn't meet Mr. Watson until the 2nd of November, which is the day before the first episode of the season, The Crawl. So why the hell is everybody so concerned about her then? Her imaginary friend existed for a single day, and Karen's freaking out and the teacher's calling her in for a chat? You telling me a teacher has never dealt with this kind of thing before? Get a grip! They were treating it like she'd had this friend for a long time and they were getting concerned about her. Hell, somehow even Mike knows about Mr. Watson when he goes to pick her up from school, but how? Did she seriously make an imaginary friend the day before and instantly tell her entire family? How would they have even known he's an imaginary friend to begin with instead of some dirty creep? The more you poke at it, the less sense it makes to me. Regardless of those issues though, this adventure through the memories is rather fun all the same. Next, we come back to the Hawkins Lab for the big blow up that's been a long time coming. These two have been snarking back and forth from day one, and now finally, over halfway through the season, we get that cathartic moment where the drama hits the peak, and from there onwards, you just know it's going to finally get better. Dustin comes back into the room Steve's in, and they keep snarking back and forth, and although Dustin's been a bit of a dick, in the end I think Steve is worse here. Once again, he's just being unhelpful and talking shit, and I agree with Dustin. He's seemingly hoping for Dustin to fail, which is really selfish, as in the end they're there to save Holly. Anyway, the conversation eventually turns to Eddie, and in the end Steve says outright that Eddie made a bad call and he got himself killed, and that's why Dustin is so angry. Because he knows that that's actually the truth, which was kind of cathartic because I distinctly remember thinking that exact same thing back when I watched Stranger Things 4. That his death felt completely unnecessary and like it accomplished nothing at all. So I did like that they included that line. Dustin gets enraged and starts attacking Steve, and what I thought was really great about the scene is that Dustin's just going nuts and Steve is trying to calm him down and stop him from attacking because he thinks he's going to hurt himself. He never actually attacks him back. He never punches him. It makes this scene all the more sad and shows how hurt the both of them are. Despite me mostly hating the length of this storyline, I will say as part one of the payoff, payoff, this was really well done. They end up crashing into a separate area, and Steve says he's done with Dustin and walks off on him, whilst Dustin stumbles across copies of Brenner's work from when the Upside Down first came into existence. As this is going on, Nancy and Jonathan get to up the creep factor as they continue walking through the melted hallways towards the roof, and then stumble across a trio of soldiers who had melted into the walls and floor. Ouch! So where are these dudes even from? I presume Brenner maybe sent them at the start of the story way back when the Gateway was first created, maybe? Thus, this is them probably making sure that everything was stable and then getting caught in the aftermath of the melting shit? Yikes. So yes, I would assume that after the Upside Down was created, these dudes went in without protective suits because they didn't think about it at first, I guess, and only started doing that later in Season 1 before dropping that altogether. Once they established that the bridge was formed is when the demos attacked and Al escaped. Maybe. It's kind of unclear to me. Hell, maybe these soldiers are actually from Kay's group and something went wrong when they were searching here. It's got to be one of those times, and I suppose in the end, it's not really supposed to matter all that much. It's just supposed to freak you out and up the tension for when Nancy and Jonathan are in trouble the next episode. You're worried that they're going to end up like this, all melty. At long last, we return to Eleven and Carly to hear the rest of the story. Turns out when she was escaping, Carly saw what Kay's plan was. That was to use her blood on pregnant women and infuse the fetus with this DNA, I guess, and by doing so, create more children just like them who can be used as slave soldiers. She tells Al that all of them were made in that same way using Henry's blood. That all of them were pale imitations of Henry though, and that's why her blood isn't working for Dr. K. That being said, Al is the only perfect copy of Henry, and that's why her blood would work. And that's why Kay's hunting her, and that's what awaits. Carly tells her that there are no happy endings for the two of them, and then Al storms off because, yeah, yikes. Okay, so clearly that was setting up the idea that Carly's largely given up on life, and that also that Kay is a true piece of shit, like one of the worst ones we've ever seen. The problem is though, that beyond crafting that bittersweet ending, they don't have a satisfying payoff, or really a payoff at all to Kay and her goons. The Crazy Eyes guy dies, yeah, but Kay is so much worse in every single way, and there is no justice there, no catharsis. It just feels weird. I feel like this particular scene sets up a need to see her get her proper just desserts for being so outright evil, and yet it never comes. It's a very weird decision in that way. In Camazotz, things are not going well for poor Derek, who's struggling to follow the map, and who eventually is caught by Vecna, who right from the get-go is no longer playing around. He's dropped that kindly facade. Once again, this is some incredible acting for Vecna, who just has the best furious facial expressions. Completely unhinged, and such a 180 from the kindly Mr. Watson. I think he's got to be the best actor in the season, honestly. I did like, though, that Derek is defiant at first and says that Vecna's mum gave him the map until Vecna starts threatening his family. So obviously, off-screen, Derek tells Vecna what was going on and what they were trying to do, and I think that is fair enough. What 10-year-old's gonna hold firm when you're alone in a dream world with an actual psycho who has powers and who is threatening your family? It's impressive that he even made it this far to work with him despite knowing he was going to be left behind in a cave until they figure out how to come back for him. At the same time as all of this, Max and Holly make it into the final memory, which even without spoilers, makes it clear there's going to be a confrontation. Here we get the scene of the Hawkins team trying to revive the Demogorgon so that Will can enter the hive mind again, and yeah, this scene goes very hard. The music's epic and everything's so grim and gritty. I know I've been critical of quite a lot of this episode, but when Stranger Things hits, it really hits, and this whole finale sequence is just awesome really, and it kept me on the edge of my seat as I had no idea what was going to happen. Will taps in and finds out a bunch of what we already knew, but what is pretty important information, namely that Holly and Max are together in Camazotz and Vecna's coming after them. So suddenly they know that Max is not brain dead and that she's been fighting Vecna alone all this time. I love the cutting back and forth between Will tapping in and Holly and Max alone in that house memory about to leave. Part of me wonders if they have no sense of urgency though. Those two are standing there staring out waiting to make their move, but surely they know Vecna's going to come for them soon, right? After all, they intentionally set Derek off to the cave, having been witnessed doing so by other people. Eventually he was going to realize what was up, and yet they're dawdling, and thus they get caught. It is worth it though, because this sequence where he comes down the stairs as Watson, then turns into the Hawkins Lab massacre Henry, and then further becomes full Vecna as he rounds the corner, is a cinematic masterpiece type moment that is filled with so much dread. After all, these two have zero chance against him. Al's not there, and so now you know that Will is their only hope. Except it's episode 5, and so clearly Vecna's not dying yet. I also like that they didn't have Holly conquer her fear. Despite her clearly growing braver and stronger, she still wasn't able to do it. She wasn't able to strike at him, which makes sense. She's a kid, and she's never seen this version of Vecna before. It also sets up her big moment later on in the story where she leads the group of kids to safety, and briefly fends off Vecna with her fire poker. So she fails and falters, and all hope seems lost, until we return to Will, who's tapped in and unleashing a mental assault upon Vecna. I love that moment where Vecna realizes what's happening, and he feels Will shift his power down his body into the leg, and he grabs it. He looks down at it, it's constricting, and then snap. Even for a viney tendril man, snapped limbs make me gag. But if anybody deserves it, it's him. Grounded for the moment, Will forces his neck to turn, and I kind of expected that too was about to snap, but instead he starts talking through Vecna, telling Max that she needs to run because that's all he can do. He just isn't strong enough to do any more than slightly wound Vecna. So Vecna stands up and starts demanding that Will get out of his head, and he fights back, which is when Will starts screaming. And he is screaming and writhing for way too long before any of them do anything about it. Why aren't they zapping the demo to get him out? It takes him full on getting blasted away from there to do anything about it, and by that point it's too late and he's lost in Vecna's mental prison. Some safety net. This then leads us into the final scene of the episode, a bit of a cool down and a cliffhanger set up for episode 6. We're on the roof of the lab with Nancy and Jonathan, and it's clear that this is the origin of the melty vibe they've been coming across. Using their flashlights, they figure out that there's something invisible floating above the lab, and Jonathan throws a pipe at it which exposes it completely, and at the same time, Dustin's working his way through Brenna's notes. He figures out that it's not a shield generator, but more an instant death button if they hit it too hard. Jonathan makes contact and says that they found it, but of course Dustin can't warn them because the walkie-talkie broke when he and Steve were having their little brawl. Things then get really tense as Dustin's running up the stairs to try to make it to them, screaming all the while that they can't do anything to it or they will all die. Then of course, Nancy shoots it, which feels extremely reckless, you know? I know she wants her sister back, but this is so absurd, it's comical. Who knows what could happen? Even if they did want to destroy it, it feels like the type of thing you'd want a bomb to destroy or something similar, so you could do it at range in case it explodes and you join the Melty Boys downstairs. However, she does shoot it and the episode ends, which is honestly a perfect Netflix cliffhanger as it leaves you wanting to jump immediately into the next episode. So that is the ending, and I will say, it was a mixed bag for me. I did like a lot of the more tense stuff, but there was also a lot of repetitive sequences and a decline in some of the story logic. On top of that, a lot of things actually look worse when you know where the story's heading and that they won't get a satisfying payoff. With all that being said though, these have just been my opinions and I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of the episode? Did you like it? Hate it? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe and let me know.